By the time the sun touched the horizon, Thomas Smith was already combing the beach again, same as yesterday, same as every morning since the accident took his wife. The others called it obsession. He called it keeping his hands busy so his heart wouldn't break twice. The ocean had taken her and maybe part of him with her, but he still walked its edge like a man listening for a reply. His canvas sack dragged through the wet sand, heavy not with fish but with shells. To most, they were worthless. To Thomas, they were memories, each one a promise he refused to let drown. From the pier, the voices came as always. "Morning, Shellman," someone shouted. Laughter followed. Men who'd given up dreaming long before he ever did. Thomas didn't answer. He never did. He just crouched, brushed sand from a pink conch, and studied its spiral until the noise behind him faded into waves. Up the boardwalk, his daughter Emma waited with her backpack, her small frame dwarfed by the railing. The school bus had long since left, but she didn't seem to mind. "They were laughing again," she said quietly as he reached her. Thomas kept his eyes on the sea. "People laugh when they forget how to hope," he said. "Don't learn that from them." She hesitated. "Do you really think Mom can hear you when you talk to the ocean?" "I think she's the reason it still listens," he said softly. They walked together to the diner that still let him run a tab. Toast, 1 egg, and coffee, split between them. The waitress pretended not to notice that the bills never caught up. Emma turned a small shell in her fingers, listening to it. "This one sounds like her," she said. Thomas smiled without looking up. "Then we'll keep it safe." When they stepped back outside, the same dockhands passed by carrying nets and mocking grins. "Hey, Tommy, you catch any rent money out there today?" one of them said. "Might be time to trade that bucket for a real job." He didn't stop walking. The laughter rolled over his shoulders like the tide. Back at the beach, he opened his weathered notebook, a mess of tide charts, coordinates, and little drawings his late wife used to call his madness. He still wrote in it every day, recording patterns, collecting pieces of a dream she once believed in too. Emma crouched beside him. "Why do you keep looking?" she asked. Thomas glanced at the horizon, voice barely above a whisper. "Because she always said the ocean keeps its secrets until you've earned them. Maybe today's the day it gives one back." For a moment the sea went still, just wind, gulls, and that endless gray line. To anyone else it was just another morning. But to Thomas Smith it was one more chance to prove that love, faith, and stubborn hope still meant something. If you felt this beginning, subscribe so you don't miss what the sea reveals next. The tide was low that evening, the kind Grace used to love. Thomas remembered how she'd walk barefoot, daring the cold waves to chase her up the shore, laughing when they caught her ankles. He'd carried a bucket back then, not a sack. It was her idea to fill it, not with fish or bait, but with shells. "Every shell's a story," she used to say, crouching beside him in the surf. "Something lived here once, loved here once. The sea keeps their memories, and if we listen, maybe it'll share one." He'd teased her for it, of course. "You think a clam's gonna whisper life advice to me?" Grace only smiled, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "Maybe not today, but one day you'll wish you'd listened." Now, years later, Thomas could still hear her voice in the wind. The same stretch of sand, the same restless waves, only colder somehow. The ocean hadn't changed, but everything else had. Grace's laughter had gone quiet, her touch replaced by the ache of absence that time refused to dull. That night, as Emma slept in the small rented house they could barely afford, Thomas sat by the window with his shell collection spread across the table. Some cracked, some gleaming, all chosen with care. He traced their ridges under his thumb, each one carrying the weight of memory. Wedding vows spoken at this very shore, the day they learned Emma would be born, the last sunset before Grace's illness took hold. He'd tried to fish again after she passed, but the sea wouldn't have him. Every time he cast his net, it came back empty. Every time he mended it, The holes returned. So he walked instead. Walked and collected what the water offered, like she had taught him. In the morning, Emma padded into the kitchen, hair tangled, eyes half awake. "You're up early again," she murmured. "Couldn't sleep," he said. The tide was right. She frowned at the pile of shells. "Mom liked those too, didn't she?" Thomas smiled faintly. "She believed they carried stories. Said if we kept collecting them, maybe one would tell us something worth keeping." Emma picked up a small scallop shell and held it to her ear. "What do you think this one says?" He thought about lying, about saying something light to make her smile, but instead he said, "It says she's proud of you." Emma blinked, clutching it to her chest. "Do you really think she'd be proud?" "I know she would." They sat in silence for a while, watching the light creep across the kitchen floor. Outside, gulls cried over the water. The world, despite everything, kept moving. Thomas reached for his notebook, adding a line under yesterday's tide chart. "Grace's promise still keeps the waves turning." He looked at Emma, who was still holding the shell close, eyes closed as if listening for something deeper. "Come on," he said softly. "Let's go hear the ocean together." The lantern flickered weakly on the small kitchen table, its light stretching over chipped plates and a pot of cooled tea. The meal was simple: bread torn unevenly, a small fish split in half, and salt scraped from an old jar. Thomas sat across from Emma, elbows on the wood, his face still rough from the wind. She picked at her crust, the silence between them heavier than the meal itself. He watched her quietly, the way her eyes followed the flame instead of him. She was too young to carry silence like this, but she'd learned from him how to swallow worry, how to nod instead of complain. When she finally spoke, her voice came soft, uncertain. "Dad, does the ocean ever talk back? When you listen to the shells?" Thomas paused, a half smile touching the corner of his mouth. He looked toward the cracked window, where the sea's rhythm pressed faintly through the night. "Not yet," he said, "but she will." Emma tilted her head. "How do you know?" He tore a piece of bread, dipping it into the salt water they used for flavor. "Because your mom said the sea doesn't stay quiet forever. She listens first, then she answers." He set the bread on her plate. "You just have to wait long enough to hear what she's saying." Emma leaned her chin into her hand, eyes squinting like she was testing whether that could really be true. The rain outside tapped lightly on the roof, slow and steady. She asked, "Was Mom really good at hearing her?" Thomas smiled a little wider now, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "She was the best listener I ever met. Said the waves carried stories older than us, that if you wanted to understand life, you had to start with the tide." He gestured to the small collection of shells sitting on the shelf behind them, each cleaned, labeled with dates and locations in his careful handwriting. "These are her stories. I just keep adding to them." Emma studied the shells. Some were broken, edges sharp, others gleamed faintly under the lamplight. "Do you think she can still hear you when you talk to her?" Thomas looked down at his hands, calloused fingers, salt-stained knuckles. "I don't know," he admitted, "but sometimes when I walk that beach, I feel like she's close, like she's watching the tide with me." For a while they both sat still. The storm outside gathered strength, a low rumble moving through the air. Then Emma reached for the fish, dividing the smaller half toward his plate. "Mom would say we're wasting good food by just staring at it," she said with a shy smile. Thomas chuckled, quiet, but real. "She would, wouldn't she?" He lifted his mug in a small toast. "To your mom." To Grace, Emma raised hers too. "To the sea that listens." They ate in peace, the wind curling softly around the shack, the ocean murmuring just beyond the window. Still silent for now, but not forever. By mid-morning, the docks of Shell Bay were alive with noise. engines sputtering, gulls screaming, boots clattering on the planks. Thomas Smith moved through it all like a ghost in worn denim, hauling ropes and patching nets that weren't his. He worked for anyone who'd pay a day's wage, but lately even that was drying up. "You'll find Atlantis before a paycheck, Tommy," one of the younger crewmen shouted from the next boat over. Laughter broke across the dock, echoing off the metal hulls. Thomas didn't look up. He tied another knot, steady, deliberate. A knot was something you could control. The sea, the work, the laughter, you couldn't. "Hey, Shellman," another called. "Heard any clams whispering about buried treasure today?" "Leave him," said an older voice, though even that came with a smirk. "Man's harmless." The word landed harder than it should have. Harmless, like being kind and quiet, was a flaw. Thomas pulled his cap lower and kept working. When the dock cleared, he loaded his few supplies into a cart and started the long walk home. The air smelled of brine and oil, and the wooden planks beneath his boots were slick from tidewater. He passed the fish market where the morning's catch was already being weighed and cleaned, buckets of silver bodies glinting under sunlight. It had been years since he'd brought home fish that fresh. Their shack sat on the far edge of town, past the rusting fuel drums and the cracked road that led to the dunes. It was small, one room wider than a trailer, the roof patched with mismatched tin. Inside, the air was heavy with salt and the faint sweetness of drying shells. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, arranging them on a towel. She'd learned to organize them like he did, by pattern, size, and tone of color. On the shelf above her, glass jars lined the wall, each labeled in his faded handwriting, "Moontide, Dawncatch, After Storm." "Did they tease you again?" she asked without looking up. He hesitated, setting his card aside. "Nothing worth remembering." "Then don't," she said simply, holding up a shell the color of milk and rust. "This one looks like it's smiling." Thomas crouched beside her, the ache in his knees sharp. "You see what others don't," he said. "That's a gift." She grinned, proud of herself. "You taught me that." He reached for the smallest jar on the counter, the one marked Grace's Tide. Inside were 6 perfect shells, smooth as river stones. "These ones," he said, tapping the glass, "are why I keep going. Every wave brings something back. We just have to keep watching outside." Laughter drifted faintly from the harbor again. But this time, Thomas didn't flinch. He sat on the floor beside his daughter, labeling new jars with the steady hand of a man who'd found purpose in patience. Let them laugh, he thought. The tide was changing, and somewhere beneath the noise he could feel it turning his way. The wind came first, sharp, howling through the boards of the shack like it wanted to rip the walls apart. Then came the rain, hard and cold, hammering the coast in gray sheets. The storm season had arrived early that year, but Thomas didn't stay inside. He never did. He stood at the threshold, hood down, staring out at the ocean as the waves crashed higher than the dunes. The world looked like it was being rewritten, sand stripped away, sea foam tearing across the beach like white fire. Behind him, Emma's voice carried through the thunder. "Dad, you can't go out in that." He turned slightly, his eyes distant. "Storms bring up the old things, the ones buried deep." "That's not safe," she said, clutching his sleeve. "Ah, you'll freeze." He pulled free gently, a ghost of a smile on his face. "Your mom used to say the sea gives more when it's angry. Maybe it's time it gave something back." Before she could argue, he stepped into the rain. The downpour swallowed him instantly. Water ran down his face, his coat, into his boots. But he kept walking. Each step sank deeper into the soaked sand until the tide kissed his knees. The sky cracked with lightning far out over the horizon, bright enough to show how small he looked against the roaring dark. He scanned the beach with the same slow, patient rhythm as always, eyes to the tide line, searching through tangled kelp and driftwood. The waves surged around him, soaking his jeans, numbing his fingers, but he didn't stop. The shells came easier after storms. Grace had been right about that. The ocean always brought something back. Back at the shack, Emma paced, chewing her sleeve. Finally, she grabbed the yellow raincoat from the hook and bolted outside. The wind nearly knocked her down, but she pushed through it, calling his name. She spotted him near the rocks, bent low, hand buried in the wet sand. His clothes clung to him like a second skin. When he turned, she ran straight to him and threw the coat around his shoulders. "Mom would have gone too," she said breathlessly. Thomas froze, looking down at her small face, the rain dripping from her chin. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that Grace wouldn't have wanted this, that the storms had already taken enough. But the truth was, Emma was right. Grace had loved the sea even when it raged, especially then. He knelt, his hand trembling as he brushed a clump of seaweed aside. Beneath it, a single shell gleamed, a perfect spiral streaked with gold veins, the kind he'd never seen before. "Look at that," he whispered. Emma crouched beside him, eyes wide. "It's beautiful." He placed it carefully into her palm. "Your mother would have said this one was worth the storm." The wind howled again, but this time Thomas didn't flinch. For the first time in years, the sea didn't feel cruel. It felt alive. Like Grace was still out there, guiding him toward something more than memory. The morning light filtered weakly through the kitchen window as Emma wrapped the golden-veined shell in tissue paper. Thomas watched her from the counter, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. The shell caught the sun for a brief moment before she tucked it carefully into her backpack. "You sure you want to take that one?" he asked softly. "It's your favorite." She nodded. "We're supposed to bring something that reminds us of family. I think Mom would like this one being shown." Thomas's throat tightened, but he smiled. "Then she'd be proud of you already." Outside, the bus rumbled to a stop. Emma ran out the door, rain boots splashing in the puddles, her ponytail bouncing. Thomas stood at the window, watching until the bus turned the corner and disappeared down the road. At school, the classroom smelled of paint and construction paper. Miss Adler, the art teacher, clapped her hands together. "All right, class. Today we're doing our Family Treasures presentation. I want to see something that means a lot to you." Kids pulled out old photos, trinkets, medals, and framed drawings. When it was Emma's turn, she walked to the front, small and nervous, clutching the wrapped bundle. "This," she began, unwrapping it slowly, "is a shell my dad found after the big storm. He says the ocean gives back what it takes if you just keep believing. My mom used to say that too." For a moment the room was quiet. The shell gleamed under the fluorescent light, soft gold lines swirling like lightning frozen in time. Miss Adler leaned closer, eyes wide. "That's beautiful, Emma. It looks almost like marble. Did your dad polish it?" Emma shook her head. "No, ma'am. The ocean did." The teacher smiled warmly, but before she could say more, a voice snorted from the back. "Of course it's from her dad," one boy whispered loudly. "Probably found it in the trash like all his other junk." A few others giggled. "Yeah," another said. "Maybe he's starting a garbage museum." Emma froze, clutching the shell tighter. Miss Adler's expression hardened. "That's enough, Ryan." The laughter died down, but the damage lingered. Emma stood there trying to keep her chin up like her dad always did. "My dad says the ocean keeps its promises," she said quietly, "even if people forget." The teacher gave her a nod of encouragement. "That's a lovely thought, Emma. Thank you for sharing it." When the bell rang, Emma stayed behind to rewrap the shell. Miss Adler knelt beside her. "You know," she said, "the people who laugh are usually the ones who don't understand beauty when they see it. Don't let them change how you see the world." Emma smiled faintly. "That's what my dad says too." Later that afternoon, she ran home and set the shell back in its place on the shelf. Thomas noticed the silence in her eyes but didn't ask. He just placed his hand over hers and said, "The world doesn't always see treasure right away. Sometimes it needs time." She nodded. "But we already know, don't we?" He smiled. "We always have." The evening sun stretched long gold ribbons through the shack's windows, lighting the shelves of shells like quiet trophies. Thomas was out on the dock fixing a net, and Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, still thinking about the laughter from school. She reached for the golden-veined shell, the one her teacher had admired, and turned it over in her hands. It felt heavier than the others, dense somehow, as if it held a heartbeat. She traced the ridges with her thumb. "You're not trash," she whispered. "You're beautiful." Then the jar slipped. It wasn't much, a small fumble, the kind that happens when tired hands tremble. But it was enough. The jar hit the wooden floor and rolled, clinking once before shattering against the wall. The shell fell free, bouncing once, twice, then cracked down the middle. Emma gasped. "No, no, no, please, no!" She scrambled on her knees, gathering the pieces, tears blurring her vision. But when she lifted one half, her breath caught. Inside, nestled in the hollow core, was something round and glowing softly in the dim light. A pearl. It wasn't the small, cloudy kind she'd seen in jewelry catalogs. This one was large, smooth, almost alive with color. Hues of rose and ivory rippled under its surface as she turned it in her palm. "Dad!" she shouted, voice breaking. "Dad, come quick!" Outside, Thomas straightened from his work, alarm flashing in his eyes. He rushed inside, wiping his hands on a rag. "What happened? Are you hurt?" She held out her trembling hand. "No, but look." He blinked, confused, kneeling down beside her. His gaze dropped to the pieces on the floor. The shell split cleanly in two, the pearl glowing faintly between them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Emma," he whispered, voice barely holding steady. "Where did you get that?" "It's the one from the storm," she said, "the one you found near the rocks." Thomas took it carefully, his rough fingers dwarfed by the smooth, perfect sphere. He turned it under the light, the reflection painting soft halos across his weathered face. "It was inside all this time," Emma said in awe. He nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "Your mother used to say beauty hides where the world doesn't look. Guess she was right again." A silence filled the room, heavy but electric, as if the walls themselves understood the weight of what had been found. Outside, the tide lapped gently against the shore, calmer than usual, almost reverent. Emma leaned closer. "Do you think there are more?" Thomas looked toward the window where dusk settled over the waves. "If there's one," he said softly, "there's a chance there's many. Maybe the ocean's been keeping its promise after all." He set the pearl on the table between them. The faint glow reflected in both their eyes, father and daughter staring at something far greater than luck. It wasn't just treasure. It was proof that faith, even the smallest kind, had finally answered back. The lamp on the table flickered, throwing a warm halo across the small kitchen. Rain tapped softly on the roof, gentler now, like the storm had decided to listen. Thomas sat motionless, elbows on the table, eyes locked on the pearl. It looked impossibly pure against the scarred wood, its light soft but steady, like it had been waiting for this moment. Emma leaned close, chin resting on her folded arms. "It doesn't even look real," she whispered. Thomas didn't answer right away. He reached out, tracing a finger around the pearl's edge, but not quite touching it. His hand shook slightly. "That's because things like this," he said slowly, "aren't supposed to be." He glanced toward the shelf where the cracked shell sat open, its halves curved like broken wings. Grace's favorite jar. He'd kept her handwriting taped to the glass, a fading label that read, "Hope finds its way home." For a moment, the sound of the sea filled the silence between them. Then Thomas whispered, "Grace said the sea keeps her promises." Emma looked up. "You mean, Mom?" He nodded. "She used to say the ocean gives back what it takes, just not when or how you expect it. I thought it was just her way of making loss sound softer." His eyes drifted back to the pearl. But maybe she meant it. Emma smiled faintly. So, do you think she sent it? Thomas exhaled, a deep, trembling breath that felt like something breaking open inside him. If anyone could find a way, he said, it'd be her. They sat together for a long time, saying nothing more. The lamplight shimmered on the pearl's surface, and as it turned, they both saw a faint swirl inside, something like the reflection of a wave. Thomas finally stood, rubbing his face. We'll need to be sure, he said. Could be a fake. Could be something else. But what? Emma asked. He smiled, a small, tired thing full of awe. Even if it isn't worth a penny, I think we just found proof that we were never crazy for believing. He walked to the window and looked out over the moonlit beach. The tide was pulling out again, leaving a silver trail on the sand. You know, he murmured, your mom once found her first shell right after a storm like this. She said the sea gives gifts when you've earned them. Emma joined him at the window. Then maybe this was hers. He turned, meeting her gaze, and for the first time in years, his eyes weren't tired. They were alive. No, he said softly. This one's ours. They placed the pearl in a small glass bowl by the window, letting it catch the moonlight. The glow bounced across the room like a heartbeat, pulsing with quiet wonder. Thomas reached over, brushing his hand against Emma's shoulder. Looks like your mom was right again, he said with a faint smile. The ocean does keep its promises. Outside, the tide whispered back as if it agreed. The morning after the discovery, Thomas woke to the sound of knocking. Not the usual polite kind, but sharp, hurried raps that carried through the thin door of their shack. Emma was still half asleep, rubbing her eyes when he opened it to find Mrs. Dwyer from down the lane holding a plate of muffins. Well, she said, eyes darting past him. I saw the paper. Congratulations, Thomas. A real pearl, huh? He frowned. How'd you... It's right there in the Gazette, she said, waving the newspaper. The headline was small but bold enough to sting. Shellman finds pearl. Thomas felt his stomach sink. The nickname they'd given him out of mockery had now become a headline. Mrs. Dwyer smiled too wide, pushing past him. Mind if I have a look? Just for curiosity's sake, of course. Before he could answer, she was already inside, eyes scanning the room like a crow searching for something shiny. It's not much to see, he muttered, moving to block the small glass bowl on the windowsill. She peered around him. My, she said softly. So it's true. A knock came again. This time 2 fishermen from the pier, both grinning as if they'd been waiting for this day. Morning, Captain Treasure, one of them laughed. You planning to retire early, or should we start calling you the Pearl King? The other man elbowed him. Maybe he'll finally buy us all a drink. Emma stood near the corner, clutching her sketchbook. She didn't like the way they looked at her father. Their eyes weren't laughing anymore. They were measuring. Thomas forced a tight smile. It's not for sale, he said quietly. But the visitors didn't listen. They lingered, making jokes that felt like traps, asking questions that sounded like interest but tasted like greed. By noon, half the town seemed to know. The phone at the bait shop rang with questions. People walked slower when passing his shack. That afternoon, a man from the Seaside Chronicle came by, camera in hand. Just a quick photo, he said cheerfully. Human interest piece. Folks love a local miracle. Thomas stood beside Emma, his hand resting on her shoulder as the flash went off. The photographer thanked them and left, his car tires crunching down the dirt road. When the door shut, Emma whispered, They're all different now. He nodded slowly. They are. But that's not our fault. She hesitated. Should we hide it? He looked out toward the waves, quiet for a long time. No, he said finally. We found it honestly. Grace wouldn't want us to be ashamed of what's good. But as evening fell and another knock echoed, a stranger this time, a man in a crisp jacket, asking if Thomas had considered appraisal options, he felt a chill run through him. The world had shifted overnight. What had been a miracle between a father and daughter was now a headline, a rumor, a prize. When the man left, Thomas locked the door, turned off the lamp, and whispered to Emma, "Tomorrow we stay quiet. The sea gave it to us, not the world." And outside, under the same moon that had once felt like a blessing, shadows lingered a little longer on the sand. It was late afternoon when the knock came again, softer this time, almost polite. Thomas hesitated before opening the door, half expecting another reporter or neighbor with a forced grin. But instead, an older woman stood there, her raincoat buttoned to the chin, a leather satchel tucked beneath one arm. "Mr. Smith?" she asked, voice calm and steady. "I'm Martha Reynolds. I used to run the town library before it closed last spring." Thomas nodded cautiously. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I read the article," she said, glancing toward the table where the pearl sat under its glass bowl. "And I think I might have something you should see. May I come in?" He stepped aside and she entered slowly, taking in the small, weathered space with a kind of quiet respect. Emma peeked from behind the curtain, watching curiously as the woman set her satchel on the table and began to unfasten the clasps. "I know you've had a lot of visitors," Martha said, "but I'm not here for the pearl. I'm here for the story behind it." Thomas frowned. "What do you mean?" She unfolded a large, yellowed sheet of paper, edges torn, creases running like rivers across it. "This," she said, "is a copy of a shoreline survey from 1883. It belonged to the Pearl Cooperative of Clearwater Bay." Thomas leaned closer. "Never heard of it." "Most haven't," Martha said. "It was a small local effort, fishermen who dove for natural pearls along this coast. They operated quietly, sold through a few traders, and made a modest living. Then one summer, a hurricane tore through and scattered everything. Records say the co-op vanished overnight. Some claimed the storm buried the beds themselves." She pointed to a spot on the map, just south of where Thomas's shack stood. "This inlet here," she continued, "matches your stretch of beach exactly. If your pearl came from one of those old beds, it could mean that the whole field's still down there," Thomas finished softly. Martha nodded. "I can't say for certain. But when I saw your name in the paper, something told me to find this." She smiled faintly. "I spent 30 years cataloging things people thought were forgotten. This might be one of them." Emma crept closer. "So you think Mom's beach used to be a pearl farm?" Martha's eyes softened. "I think your mother had good instincts. The ocean remembers where beauty hides. It just takes patience to listen." Thomas exhaled slowly, the weight of it all pressing into his chest. He traced the inked lines on the old paper, seeing the coastline not as it was, but as it had been, alive with divers, small boats, laughter, and hope. "Why bring this to me?" he asked quietly. Martha smiled. "Because you're the only one who still walks those sands the way they did, looking for meaning instead of money." He didn't know what to say. She gathered her papers, preparing to leave, but paused at the door. "Be careful, Mr. Smith. Secrets like this don't stay quiet for long." When she left, Thomas unfolded the map again. Emma leaned in beside him, eyes wide. "Dad," she whispered, "look where her mark is. It's the same cove where we found Mom's shell." He stared at the spot, feeling a shiver rise through him, not of fear, but recognition. The past, it seemed, had been waiting beneath their feet all along. For days, Thomas barely slept. Martha's map lay open on the table, weighed down by jars of shells and notebooks filled with scribbles. The rain had cleared, leaving the air crisp and sharp. Each morning he walked the same shoreline with new purpose, measuring, counting, marking where each shell came from. Emma watched him fill the little shack with order. The walls, once cluttered with tools and nets, now gleamed with rows of labeled jars: North Point, Low Tide, Rocky Inlet, Evening Drift, South Cove, After Storm. "What are you doing, Dad?" she asked one night, sitting cross-legged on the floor. Thomas didn't look up from his notes. "Trying to see what the ocean's been trying to tell me," he said. He spread several shells on the table, each a slightly different shade of cream. These all came from the same cove, different weeks. "But look, see how the inside's thicker here, and this ridge runs in the same curve." Emma leaned closer. "Like they match." "Exactly," he said. "That's not random. That's cultivation." She tilted her head. "Like farming?" He nodded. "Someone used to grow them here. Maybe the Pearl Co-op Martha mentioned. These shells didn't just drift in. They were grown and harvested." He stepped back, staring at the map pinned to the wall. Red ink circles connected the coastal marks, patterns emerging where no one else had thought to look. The realization filled him with a strange, quiet electricity. For the first time in years, Thomas felt like his life had direction again, not just survival, not just scraping by. There was meaning in the pattern, a thread tying him to Grace, to the past, to something bigger than pity or mockery. That evening he walked the shore again, notebook in hand. The tide was low, the sand cool beneath his boots. He knelt at the waterline, holding up a newly found shell to the fading light. It had that same curved ridge, smooth and deliberate. Grace's voice echoed in his memory, soft, playful, full of belief. "Every shell remembers where it came from, Tom. The sea doesn't forget." He smiled faintly. "You were right again," he murmured. When he returned home, Emma had drawn a rough chart of her own, colored pencil lines tracing his red marks, connecting clusters of shells into shapes. "It looks like a necklace," she said proudly. He stared at it for a long time. The pattern of coves, the curvature of the old shoreline. It wasn't random, it was designed. "That's it," he whispered. They arranged their beds in loops, each sector feeding the next. Like a chain, he placed her drawing beside the old map, aligning the edges. The lines matched almost perfectly. Emma looked up at him. "So the ocean's still keeping their secret?" He nodded, maybe waiting for someone to finish what they started. He reached for the lamp and turned it low, letting the light fall across the jars of shells. Each one shimmered faintly, as if the sea itself had begun to whisper back. And for the first time since Grace's passing, Thomas didn't feel like a man left behind. He felt like a man on the edge of rediscovery. The morning sun spilled through the kitchen window, catching the edges of the old map on the wall. Thomas had just finished his coffee when he heard a car door slam outside, an unfamiliar sound on their quiet lane. Through the window, he saw a sleek, silver truck pull up, its paint too clean for this town. A tall man stepped out wearing sunglasses and a practiced smile. Thomas sighed. "Looks like another one." Emma peeked over her cereal bowl. "Another reporter?" "Worse," he muttered. "A man in nice shoes." The stranger walked right up to the porch and rapped twice on the door. "Mr. Smith? Thomas Smith?" Thomas opened it halfway. "That's me." "Calvin Boyd," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm with Boyd Coastal Holdings. I've heard quite a bit about you and your little discovery." Thomas didn't take his hand. "Most folks have." Boyd chuckled as if they were old friends. "I admire a man who makes something out of nothing. You've certainly stirred up interest around here. Mind if I come in for a minute?" Thomas hesitated, then stepped aside. Boyd walked in like he owned the place, glancing at the jars on the shelves, the map pinned to the wall. "You've been busy," he said. "Organized." "I like that. What do you want, Mr. Boyd?" "Calvin, please," he said smoothly, "and I'll be straight with you. I represent a small group of investors who see potential in this shoreline. There's talk that it might have historical or, shall we say, commercial value. I'd hate to see you stuck managing all that pressure on your own." Thomas folded his arms. "Pressure's part of life." "Of course," Boyd said with an easy laugh. "Still, it might be nice to have a little breathing room. My group's prepared to make you an offer. $10,000 for the rights to the stretch you've been collecting from." Clean, simple, no strings attached. Emma froze mid-bite. 10,000, she whispered. Thomas didn't move. He studied the man carefully. That's a lot for a bit of sand you called worthless last month. Boyd's grin didn't falter. Things change. Let's just say the market's evolving. Besides, it's not about the money. It's about peace of mind. You can move inland, get a better place for your daughter. Let us handle the red tape. Thomas's jaw tightened. You think I'm just sitting here waiting for someone to buy my peace of mind? Boyd's tone softened. I think you're a good man in a hard spot. And I think you know storms come and go, but opportunities like this don't. Thomas stepped closer, his voice calm but solid. You're right about one thing. I am in a hard spot, but I've worked too long, lost too much to sell what my wife loved for pocket change. Boyd blinked. The charm slipped for just a second before returning. Fair enough. Think it over, Mr. Smith. My card's there if you change your mind. He placed it on the table and walked out, his shoes leaving faint dust tracks on the floorboards. Emma looked up. Are we in trouble, Dad? Thomas shook his head, staring at the business card like it was a warning. No, sweetheart. Trouble's when you stop saying no. Outside, the silver truck rolled away, leaving behind tire marks and the faint scent of greed in the sea air. The morning started with the kind of silence that usually meant peace. The gulls were quiet, the tide gentle, the shack still. Thomas poured his coffee and thought about heading down to the beach early, maybe bringing Emma along before school. But when he reached for his boots by the door, something caught his eye. The shed's door was hanging open. He frowned. He always kept it latched. Always. The closer he got, the stranger it felt. The sand around the shed was uneven, scattered with footprints too large to be his. The latch was twisted, hanging loose like it had been forced open with a crowbar. Emma, he called, his voice tight. Stay by the porch. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning like they were in pain. Inside, the air smelled of salt and dust and something else, the sour sting of destruction. Every jar he'd labeled was gone or shattered. The neat rows he'd built, the careful order, the patient work, it all lay in ruin. Fragments of shells glittered across the floor like cruel confetti. His notebooks were torn, pages soaked through with spilled oil from the lantern. Emma's bright crayon drawings, the ones that once hung beside the map, lay trampled in the dirt. Thomas stood in the doorway, numb. For a moment he didn't move, didn't breathe. It was as if someone had ripped open the last thing that still connected him to hope. Emma ran up behind him before he could stop her. Dad, what happened? He swallowed hard. Someone broke in. She stepped inside, staring at the mess. My drawings. Her voice cracked. She knelt, trying to smooth one flat, the one where she'd drawn him, the beach, and Grace's favorite shell. A footprint ran right through it. Thomas crouched beside her, but his hands were shaking too much to help. It's all right, he said softly, though the words came out hollow. We'll fix it. But he didn't believe it. Not this time. He sat down on the edge of the broken workbench and pressed his palms to his face. Behind his eyelids, all he could see was Grace, laughing, barefoot on this same beach, telling him that the sea never took without giving. But looking at the wreckage, it felt like the ocean had finally turned its back on him. Emma picked up one of the few intact shells from the corner. It was chipped, dull, unremarkable. She held it out to him anyway. Maybe this one still has something inside, she said. Thomas took it gently, running his thumb along the cracked ridge. For the first time in months, he didn't feel wonder. He just felt tired. He looked out through the open door toward the distant water. The tide had started to rise again, slow and relentless. He clenched the broken shell in his hand. They think they can take it all, he whispered, more to himself than to her. But they can't take what she believed. Emma's eyes filled, but she nodded. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the ruined jars. It sounded almost like laughter, the same kind that used to come from the docks. But this time Thomas didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at the horizon, wondering if faith was something you had to lose before you could ever find it again. The morning came pale and quiet, the kind of dawn that looked half frozen in its own light. The wind had gone still, and the sea lay gray and glassy, as if holding its breath. Thomas hadn't slept. He'd spent the night sitting on the porch with the oil lamp flickering low, staring at the outline of the broken shed. When Emma finally drifted off, clutching her patched-up drawing, he stood, pulled on his coat, and walked toward the water. He didn't take his bucket or his net. His hands were empty, and maybe that was how it needed to be. The beach stretched long and lonesome, marked by nothing but footprints, his own from yesterday. He followed them down the slope, the sound of his boots sinking into wet sand echoing softly in the dawn. He stopped at the tide line where the waves whispered and retreated like they were apologizing for the night before. He looked out at the horizon. For years he'd loved this view. Now it looked like a stranger. He knelt and let the cold foam reach his fingers. The salt stung. "You could have kept her for yourself," he murmured, voice low. "But you gave her to me. And now, what do you want from me, Grace?" The question carried off on the wind. No answer came, only the steady rhythm of the sea. He stood again, exhaling slowly. "I'm tired," he said to the water, "but I'm not done." The tide shifted then, nudging something small toward him. He looked down. There, half buried in wet sand, lay a single shell, not cracked, not faded. Its edges were smooth and strong, its surface gleaming faintly, even under the weak light. He crouched and picked it up carefully, brushing away the sand. It was perfect, spiraled like a fingerprint, delicate but whole. For a long moment he just stared at it, feeling a lump rise in his throat. Grace had always said the ocean had a way of speaking without words. He used to think that was just one of her pretty notions, something poetic she'd dreamed up between storms. But standing there now, shell in hand, he could almost hear her voice again. "Every one of them is a survivor, Tom. Waves beat them, rocks break them, but some stay whole because they're meant to." He smiled faintly, the first real smile since the break-in. "Still stubborn, huh?" he said to no one in particular. He slipped the shell into his coat pocket and turned toward home. The sun had begun to rise behind him, a thin line of gold splitting the horizon. The light caught the wet sand and made it shimmer like a path. When he reached the edge of the dunes, he looked back once more at the sea. "All right," he said softly. "I get it. I'll keep going." He could rebuild the jars. He could find more shells, maybe even more pearls, but it wasn't about that anymore. It never really had been. It was about keeping a promise. And as he walked back up the shore, the waves seemed to murmur after him, not words, but a rhythm of agreement, like the ocean itself was nodding in quiet approval. The library smelled faintly of dust and salt, the same salt that clung to everything in their little town. Thomas sat at the long oak table, charts spread out before him, their corners curling like old paper breathing again. Lines of faded ink traced forgotten waters, and he followed them with his finger, whispering to himself, "Storm paths, current flows. There has to be a reason they were here." Across from him, Martha Reynolds peered through her reading glasses, her pencil tapping the edge of a map labeled 1892, Coastal Survey of Shell Key Inlet. "You're not wrong," she said quietly. "The hurricane paths you marked, those match the same zones where pearl farms once thrived. Hurricanes tore them apart, but they always came back to the same regions." Thomas rubbed his temples. "The sea rebuilds faster than people do." Martha smiled faintly. "That's what history keeps trying to tell us." They had spent 3 days cross-referencing everything she could dig up. Fishermen's logs, tide records, hand-drawn maps yellowed with age. The more they compared, the more a pattern began to emerge, circular storms carving through the same stretch of coastline over and over. Each time, the old oyster beds shifted slightly south, rebuilding just beyond the last ruin. Like the ocean's memory moves with the tide, Thomas murmured. Martha nodded, marking another storm track with red pencil. You see this? The 1876 path overlaps perfectly with your cove. He leaned closer. The realization landed with quiet awe. That's exactly where Emma found the pearl. For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the wind pressed against the old window panes, making them hum softly, like the sea was eavesdropping. Thomas finally said, I thought I was just wasting time out there, collecting shells. Remembering her. You were remembering, Martha said, but maybe Grace wasn't the only one guiding you. Her tone was matter-of-fact, not mystical, but still it stirred something in him. They kept working. Thomas organized each marked region on tracing paper, aligning them against a modern satellite map Martha had printed from the library's ancient computer. Layer after layer, the picture clarified, storms, currents, and cultivation lines forming something close to a corridor beneath the waves. He stepped back, hands braced on the table. They weren't random. No, Martha said, erasing a stray mark. They were strategic. The 19th century pearl divers probably set up near these reef ridges, protected from direct current but still rich in nutrients. Thomas looked down at the glowing red and blue lines now spread like veins across the table. His heart picked up. Then it's still there. Whatever's left of it, Martha gave a small, knowing grin. Looks that way. The ocean doesn't lose what it values. It just hides it until someone pays attention again. He stared at the overlapping maps, the patterns Grace would have loved to see, and felt something shift inside him. A tide turning quietly back toward belief. When he left the library that evening, the sun was sinking over the water. He tucked the marked chart under his arm and whispered, Thank you, Martha. She smiled from the doorway. Don't thank me, Thomas. Thank the sea for remembering. As he walked home, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of salt and something else. Possibility. The morning tide was low enough that the sandbars stretched out like pale scars across the water. Thomas stood knee-deep in the shallows, jeans rolled, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the borrowed goggles hanging around his neck. Emma stood beside him, a small bucket dangling from her wrist. The borrowed gear, 2 old masks, a pair of cracked gloves, and a net with a hole near the rim, looked ridiculous against the expanse of the sea. Still, to Thomas, it felt like armor. Cold? He asked. Emma nodded but smiled. It's fine. Mom used to say the cold wakes you up. Thomas looked toward the horizon. She was right about that. Martha waited near the rocks with her notepad and a thermos of coffee, calling out, Be careful near the drop-off. The sand gives way quick. He waved to show he'd heard her. The plan was simple. Wade through the shallows, collect shell samples from the cove where the charts had overlapped, and see if the old beds were still alive. It sounded easy on paper, but to Thomas, each step into the cold surf felt like walking into memory itself. They moved slowly, scanning the seabed where sunlight fractured across the water. Emma spotted the first one, a thick, ridged shell half buried near a clump of seaweed. She crouched, brushing sand away with her fingers. Got one, she said softly. Thomas took it, turning it over in his palm. It wasn't shiny or smooth like the ones he collected for her drawings. This one was rough, heavy, and scarred. But when he tilted it, faint iridescence flickered along the inner lip, a sheen that caught his breath. Martha, he called, you might want to see this. She splashed over, notebook held high. Well, I'll be, she murmured, running her thumb along the surface. Nacre. That's what gives pearls their luster. Emma's eyes widened. So that means... Thomas nodded. It means these oysters used to make pearls. Might still. They found more as the tide began to creep back in. Dozens of shells clustered in small groups, like quiet survivors hiding under layers of sand. Each one bore the same trace of shimmer inside, the same promise. By noon, their buckets were half full. Thomas knelt to rinse his hands and stared down at the shifting light beneath the surface. "It's like they've been waiting," he said. Martha, jotting notes, looked up. "Or rebuilding. The ocean doesn't rush to show her treasures." Thomas smiled faintly. "Neither do people, I guess." He stood and looked around, the coastline stretching in every direction, waves sighing against the shore. For the first time in years, he didn't just see the sea as survival. He saw it as a partner, something alive and ancient that had chosen him for a reason he didn't yet understand. Emma walked up beside him, holding one perfect shell against the sun. The light turned it pink and gold. "Dad," she said quietly, "Mom would have liked this one." Thomas nodded, voice soft. "She's the reason we're here, kiddo." They turned back toward shore as the tide began to rise, carrying their buckets full of proof, not just of oysters or pearls, but of faith rediscovered, glimmering faintly beneath the surface of loss. The next week, the harbor changed its tune. For months, Thomas had been the punchline of every dockside joke, the shell man, the fool who collected sea trash instead of catching fish. But now, the laughter that used to ring across the piers had started to taper off. Conversations grew quieter when he walked by. Heads turned, but voices lowered. It started with a rumor. Someone from the bait shop swore they'd seen him hauling buckets out of the cove with shiny stuff inside. Someone else claimed Martha Reynolds had been at his place with old maps and a magnifying glass. By the end of the week, the word treasure had been whispered enough times that it began to sound real. Thomas noticed it in the way people looked at him, less amused, more calculating. When he arrived at the docks to sell his modest catch, the same men who once mocked him now greeted him with tight smiles. "Morning, Tom," said Gary Miller, the shrimp boat captain who used to shout, "Find Atlantis yet?" from across the pier. "Morning," Thomas replied evenly, setting his crate down. Gary scratched his neck. "Heard you've been doing some research. Those shells of yours, still bringing luck, huh?" Thomas didn't answer. He'd learned that silence unsettled people more than sarcasm ever could. A few others joined in, pretending to make small talk. One offered to tag along next time. Another suggested Thomas might need an extra pair of hands. He thanked them all and kept his eyes down, sorting fish that no one was really buying. When he turned to leave, Calvin Boyd was waiting near the edge of the dock. His expensive shoes looked out of place against the damp wood. "Smith," he called smoothly. "Busy week for you, I hear." Thomas stopped, his back stiffening. "Just working." Calvin's grin didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. Hard work always pays off, though sometimes it pays off too well. Folks are saying you found something down by the inlet." Thomas met his gaze. "Folks say a lot of things." Calvin stepped closer. "You'd tell me if you struck gold, wouldn't you? Or pearls, I suppose, in your case." Thomas smiled faintly. "If I did, I'd tell my daughter first." That landed sharper than intended. Calvin's smirk faltered. "Careful, Tom," he said finally. "Rumors bring company you don't want." He turned and walked off, his polished shoes tapping against the dock like punctuation marks. By afternoon, even Martha had heard the talk. She stopped by with a pot of clam chowder and a worried look. "You can't keep the tide from gossip, Thomas. But don't let it scare you. The truth will prove itself." "I'm not scared," he said quietly. "I just wish they'd go back to laughing." It was easier that way. That night, as he and Emma stacked their newly cleaned shells, the harbor lights flickered in the distance, boats rocking, conversations dimming, the whole town caught between disbelief and greed. Emma looked up from her drawing. "Dad, why are people staring at us now?" He smiled wearily. "Because, sweetheart, people laugh at what they don't believe in, until it starts looking real." And outside, beyond their small window, the same men who once jeered now lingered by the waterline, watching the dark horizon where Thomas would return at dawn. The laughter was gone, replaced by something heavier, silence thick with envy and wonder. The morning they went out, the sea was so still it looked like glass. The borrowed boat hummed softly as Thomas guided it toward the coordinates he'd marked, a patch of water no one cared about until now. Martha waved from the dock, notebook in hand, her gray scarf snapping in the wind. Beside him, the small dive crew checked their tanks, faces curious but unsure. "You really think there's something down there?" one of them asked. Thomas smiled faintly. "I don't think. I know." They reached the inlet where the tide shifted colors, a lighter blue that hinted at sandbars beneath. The men dropped anchor and the water rippled outward in perfect circles. Thomas pulled on his mask and gloves, the salt biting against old scars on his hands. Emma's voice echoed from memory. "Mom said the sea hides her secrets in layers." He tightened the straps. "Let's go find one." The first few minutes underwater were chaos. Visibility blurred, sand clouds swirling from every fin kick. But as the current settled, shapes began to emerge beneath him. Thomas froze, heart pounding. Rows. Straight, deliberate rows stretching along the seabed like underwater vineyards. He swam closer, brushing away sediment with his glove. Metal glinted faintly, a lattice of corroded iron frames, each square about the size of a crate. They weren't natural. They were built. The cages. He ran his hand along one of them, feeling the texture of age and salt, and beneath it, shells. Layer upon layer of oyster shells fused to the rust. When he pried one loose, nacre shimmered inside, faint but unmistakable. He kicked toward the next row. More cages. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. The dive crew caught up, shining their flashlights into the murk. One of them tapped his arm and made the universal sign for holy hell. Thomas nodded, unable to contain the grin spreading beneath his mask. He surfaced, gasping, the horizon spinning with adrenaline and disbelief. "There's rows!" he shouted toward the boat. "Rows of cages. Old, but they're there." "They're real." The men broke into laughter and disbelief. One scrambled to help him aboard while another hauled up the first sample bag. Inside were encrusted shells, still glinting faintly with iridescent film. Martha's voice crackled over the radio from shore. "What do you see?" "Proof," Thomas said, breathing hard. "They built a farm down there." A pearl farm, an entire operation. She let out a soft, incredulous laugh. Then history just came up for air. As the others examined the hull, Thomas sat at the bow, dripping seawater, staring at the waves that had hidden his wife's favorite shoreline. The rhythm of the tide against the hull sounded almost like applause. "Grace," he murmured, "you were right. The sea remembers." He looked over the side again, the water shimmering gold in the morning light. Beneath it lay a forgotten story, cages of hope, patience, and faith buried under a century of storms. And somehow, after all the years of being laughed at, Thomas realized he hadn't been searching for treasure at all. He'd been unearthing a promise, one the sea had kept, quietly waiting for him to be ready to listen. Thomas dove again before dawn, unable to wait for the tide to settle. The sea had that pale, silvery glow it gets before sunrise, calm on the surface, restless below. He followed the same route as the day before, gliding between the rows of corroded cages, flashlight beams slicing through the haze. Each one whispered history in rust and shell. Then he saw it, something gleaming faintly under a crust of coral near the base of a cage. He brushed at it, careful not to stir too much silt. The object was rectangular, brass or bronze, edges softened by time. Letters shimmered faintly as he wiped away the sand with his glove. Grace Tide Cooperative, 1893. Thomas froze. The words blurred through the mask as salt water stung his eyes. "Grace," he whispered into the regulator, the sound muffled and bubbling into nothing. He touched the plate again, tracing the letters with his thumb. The engraving was deep, deliberate. This wasn't chance. He surfaced, gasping, dragging himself over the side of the boat. The dive crew rushed over, startled by his expression. "You okay?" one asked. Thomas didn't answer at first. He just held out the plate. The sunlight hit it, and the lettering caught fire in gold. "What's it say?" He swallowed hard. "Grace," he said. "It says Grace." They passed it around, examining the oxidation, the faint marks of a craftsman long dead. But Thomas wasn't listening. His thoughts had gone miles away, back to his wife's laughter, the way she'd bend to pick up shells and whisper, "The sea keeps her promises if you keep yours." He looked at the water. The name wasn't coincidence. Couldn't be. Grace and Tide. The company, the co-op, the dream buried under a century of storms. And Grace, the woman who had believed in him when no one else did. He knelt beside the plate, running his fingers over it again. "You sent me here," he murmured. "Didn't you?" One of the divers whistled softly. "That's got to be worth a fortune to a historian or a collector." Thomas shook his head. "It's worth more than that." By the time they docked, the harbor was waking up. Martha was waiting, coat flapping in the wind. Thomas climbed out, still holding the plate like something sacred. "What did you find?" she asked. He handed it to her wordlessly. She read the inscription aloud, her voice trembling at the coincidence. "Grace and Tide." She looked up. "Thomas, that's your wife's name." "I know." Martha smiled through tears. "Then maybe this isn't just history. Maybe it's a message." Thomas looked out to sea, where sunlight was breaking across the surface. "No," he said softly. "It's a reminder that some promises are meant to resurface, no matter how long they've been buried." He turned the plate over once more before setting it gently on the dock. The tide lapped against the wood as if in agreement, the water folding back over the story it had guarded for more than 100 years. Grace, the woman and the company, bound now by name, by love, and by the unbreakable patience of the sea. The harbor wasn't ready for what came next. By mid-morning, vans with satellite dishes were lined along the pier, reporters spilling out with cameras and microphones like gulls after a catch. Someone had tipped them off about the discovery. The old Pearl Farm, the brass plate, the name Grace and Tide. And now the sleepy town of Shell Bay had turned into a spectacle. Thomas stepped out of his shack and froze. He'd seen crowds before, at church fairs, at the market, but never like this. Strangers in windbreakers shouted questions over the sound of generators. A drone buzzed overhead, filming the shoreline he'd walked in solitude for years. "Mr. Smith, how did you find it? Is it true your wife's name was Grace? Do you believe this was fate?" He didn't answer. He just adjusted his cap and walked toward his boat, Emma's small hand clutching his. She looked up at him, confused by the noise, the flashing lights. "Dad, why are they here?" "Because people love miracles," he said quietly, "especially when they think it costs nothing to believe in them." When they reached the dock, a reporter blocked his path, tall, polished, her badge swinging from a lanyard. "Thomas Smith, Channel 7 News. Folks are calling this the miracle of Shell Bay. How does it feel to be part of history?" Thomas set down his tackle box and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "history's been here the whole time. We just finally listened to it." The woman smiled, sensing a headline. "That's poetic," she said. "Can we film you holding the plate?" "No." "Would you at least share your story, what it means to you?" Thomas's eyes drifted toward the water. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about the people who worked that farm before any of us were born. And about my wife, who believed the sea keeps her promises." "Are you saying you found this because of faith?" He looked straight into the camera lens, unflinching. "No," he said, "because of listening. Faith's just what keeps you quiet long enough to hear what the world's been saying all along." The harbor went still. Even the gulls seemed to pause. The reporter lowered her mic. "Thank you," she said softly. Thomas nodded and helped Emma into the boat. As the engine sputtered to life, the cameras rolled again, but this time no one shouted questions. They just filmed. Him steering out toward the glinting horizon, Emma beside him, the small boat cutting through the water that had once been his shame and was now his vindication. Martha watched from the dock, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She'd seen Towns chase stories before, but this one was different. This wasn't about treasure. It was about a man who refused to stop believing that something small, something forgotten, could still hold meaning. By sunset, the story had already gone national, but Thomas didn't see it. He was back where he belonged, kneeling at the bow, listening to the waves breathe against the hull, whispering thanks into the wind. By the end of the week, the harbor buzzed with tension instead of excitement. The story that had once brought light now cast shadows. Calvin Boyd's name was back on everyone's lips, this time printed on legal notices pinned to the town board and mailed to Thomas's tiny shack by the shore. Thomas stood on the porch, letter in hand, the paper trembling slightly in the breeze. Emma looked up from her homework at the small table. "What is it, Dad?" He folded it quietly. "Just noise," he said, but his jaw tightened. It wasn't noise. It was a claim, filed through Boyd Development, stating that the tidal land and seabed, adjacent to Shell Bay, fell under expansion rights for the luxury resort project. Calvin's signature was bold and smug at the bottom, as if the ocean itself could be owned with ink. Word spread fast. Locals whispered that Thomas might lose everything before he even understood what he had. The same men who'd mocked him at the docks now kept their distance. Some were afraid. Others were already wondering whose side to take. That evening, Martha arrived with a stack of folders and her reading glasses perched low on her nose. "I heard about the filing," she said, brushing sand off her coat. "He's claiming the shoreline under old municipal rezoning laws. Says your discovery falls within his development boundary." Thomas let out a dry laugh. "Funny how people start remembering what's theirs when something's worth having." She smiled faintly. "That's why we'll remind him what's actually his." She set down the folders and began spreading out yellowed maps, registry notes, and copies of town records across the kitchen table. "I spent the day at the county archives. You're not going to believe what I found." Emma leaned in, fascinated. "Like a treasure map?" "In a way," Martha said. She pointed to a faint script on one of the maps, an original land registry from 1894. "See this?" Near the edge of Shell Bay, written in ornate ink, was the name Grace L. Turner. Thomas froze. "Grace." Martha nodded. "Your wife's great-grandmother. Turns out her family owned this very tidal strip until the hurricane of 1912. The land was never formally transferred, only marked abandoned use. The rights technically passed through the Turner estate, which means—" Thomas rubbed his forehead, barely breathing. "It means this beach has been Grace's all along." Martha smiled softly. "Exactly." The irony writes itself outside. Thunder rolled far off the coast, a storm brewing but not yet breaking. Thomas walked to the window, looking out at the dark water, the faint reflection of his wife's photo on the glass. "She always said the sea keeps her promises," he whispered. Martha gathered the papers. "Then maybe this is how it keeps one." He turned back, steady again, a quiet strength replacing the fear. "Let him file all the claims he wants. The tide doesn't answer to men like him." Martha nodded. "No," she said, tucking the documents into her bag. "But courts do. And tomorrow, we'll make sure it remembers who this shoreline really belongs to." The county clerk's office smelled faintly of dust and old ink, a place where history sat waiting on narrow shelves. Thomas stood at the counter, hands rough from years at sea, clutching a worn envelope that held more than paper. It held every promise Grace ever made him believe in. Martha was beside him, calm but fierce, the quiet determination of someone who'd wrestled truth from archives and whispers. The clerk, a tired man with half-moon glasses, peered at the stack of documents she handed over. "Land transfer inquiry?" he asked without looking up. "Correction," Martha said, tapping the top sheet. "Not transfer. Restoration. The tidal zone of Shell Bay was never properly released after the Turner family's loss in 1912. This is the proof." He scanned the old registry forms, the lineage records, and the notarized confirmation of Grace L. Turner's descendants, Grace Smith among them. Each page carried the faint scent of salt and ink, as if the sea itself had helped preserve them. Thomas stayed quiet, letting the papers do the talking. When the clerk finally looked up, his tone softened. "This is thorough. I'll process it right away." Martha smiled, just barely. "We'll wait." They sat on the wooden bench under a flickering light, time stretching thin as the clock ticked overhead. Emma swung her legs beside them, humming under her breath, her small hand resting on her father's arm. He leaned down. "You nervous?" She shook her head. "No, Mom's got this." He smiled faintly. "Yeah," he whispered. "She always did." After what felt like an hour, the clerk returned. He carried a single page, freshly stamped and signed. "It's official," he said, sliding it across the counter. "Grace L. Turner's rights, and by inheritance yours, Thomas and Emma Smith. The shoreline and seabed in question are legally recognized as part of your family estate." Thomas didn't speak at first. He just stared at the seal, the county's emblem embossed in gold, the ink still drying at the edges. His throat tightened, and he nodded once, a silent thank you that carried the weight of 3 generations. Outside, the wind had shifted. The tide was pulling in, slow and steady, as though the sea itself had been waiting for the paperwork to catch up with Faith. Martha tucked the certified copy into a folder. "You understand what this means?" she said quietly. "The land, the water rights, the discovery, it's all under your family name now. Boyd can't touch it." Thomas exhaled, a long, unsteady breath that sounded almost like laughter. "Grace finally came home," he said. Emma's voice broke the moment's stillness. "Mom really sent it back to us," she whispered, her eyes shining. He looked down at her, at the same freckles his wife once had, the same spark of belief. He pulled her close, the wind whipping their hair as the ocean glimmered beyond the dunes. "Yeah," he said softly. "She did. She always kept her promises, and for the first time in years, the word home didn't sound like something he'd lost. It sounded like something the tide had just returned." The divers rose through the surface like messengers from another century, their shouts echoing across the bay. The air was bright with salt and sun. A crane groaned as it lifted the first crate over the side, dripping seawater that sparkled like glass. Thomas watched, motionless, his fingers gripping the railing until the old wood bit into his palm. The crate thudded onto the deck, the sound deep and heavy, like a door unlocking after years underwater. Rick, the lead diver, knelt and pried open the lid. The hinges cracked, releasing a rush of cold, briny air. Inside lay layer upon layer of round, glistening forms, pearls, hundreds of them, each shining with a strange inner light. They rolled gently as the boat rocked, casting reflections across the hull like scattered moons. "Good God," Martha whispered. "They're real." Thomas dropped to his knees, reaching out with a trembling hand. He picked one up. It was cool at first, but as it rested in his palm, it warmed, as though it recognized him. It caught the sun in its smooth skin, turning pale gold, then rose, then white again. It looked alive. Rick took off his gloves, leaning over the box. "We found 3 more crates just like this one. They're full." Every one of them. Emma clutched her father's arm. "Daddy, are they worth a lot?" Rick laughed softly, still staring. "More than a lot, kiddo. If these are South Sea grade, and by the look of it they are, you're looking at maybe 20 million, maybe more." Martha blinked, unable to speak. 22 million, she murmured finally, almost to herself, her voice swallowed by the sea breeze. Thomas didn't move. His throat tightened. He thought of Grace again, of the nights she sat by the window, sketching the curve of a shell, saying how beauty never truly vanished. It just waited for someone patient enough to find it again. He rolled the pearl between his fingers. She was right, he said quietly. Emma leaned closer. Who, Daddy? Your mom, he whispered. She said the sea keeps what's loved. Rick radioed the harbor office, his voice trembling with adrenaline. Shell Bay recovery complete. Estimated value confirmed. Repeat, confirmed. You'll want press on standby. But Thomas wasn't listening. He walked to the bow, the pearl still in his hand. Below him, the water glimmered faintly over the ruins of the old cages. A century's worth of storms hadn't buried them, only hid them long enough to test belief. Martha joined him. Do you realize what you've done? She asked softly. You've brought history back to the surface. Thomas smiled faintly. No, he said, gazing out at the horizon. It brought itself back. I just listened. The sun dipped lower, washing the deck in amber. Emma stood beside him, her reflection rippling in the water. Can we keep one? She asked. He crouched beside her and placed a single pearl in her small hand. This one's yours, he said, a reminder that patience and love can outlast even the tide. And as the waves shimmered around them, Thomas realized he wasn't holding treasure. He was holding proof that faith, once cast into the deep, can rise again, brighter than before. The calls came before sunrise, numbers Thomas didn't recognize lighting up the cracked phone on the kitchen counter. Voices, slick with certainty, made offers that sounded like rescue dressed as business. They said words like strategic partnership and front money and exclusive rights, said they could turn his once-in-a-generation find into something respectable. Thomas listened, thanked them, and said no, not unkindly. When they pushed, he repeated it the same way he had learned to repeat his grief, soft, steady, final. He was not going to trade one kind of mockery for another. He wanted something that would last after the headlines moved on. He walked the stretch of beach where he had first courted Grace and told Emma, "We are going to build a place where kids can hold the ocean in their hands without taking it from the sea." Emma blinked up at him. "Like a house for shells." He smiled. "Exactly. The shell house." Word spread, and the harbor's noise shifted from gossip to hammers. Carpenters who had once laughed measured studs. A glassmaker offered to craft cases that refracted light the way water does. Martha wheeled in a cart of books and file boxes, promising exhibits that told the story before the storm and after. Thomas used a fraction of the sale proceeds, careful as if he were measuring flour, and signed invoices with a hand that shook more from humility than from fear. They chose a low dune set back from the tide line and framed a building with wide windows that captured the horizon. The entry floor was poured with crushed shell aggregate that glimmered like wet beach. In the main room, Thomas drew a circle on the blueprint and wrote Tidal Classroom. He and Emma painted a mural there together, a swirling map of currents and plankton blooms, every brushstroke a conversation between a father who had lost and a daughter learning how to keep. When the first school group arrived, the shell house smelled of cedar and salt. Thomas set a bowl of clean seawater on a long table and placed shells beside field magnifiers. He showed the children how nacre builds in patient layers, how oysters stitch grit into glow, how a living bay is both delicate and strong. He did not mention money. He talked about listening, how the water, the wind, and the tide speak if you quiet yourself enough. Martha unveiled a corner display titled Grace and Tide, anchored by the brass plate Thomas had found on the cage. She added letters from the old co-op and a photo of women mending nets on the same shoreline more than a century ago. Emma stood near a large cork map labeled Community Finds, inviting visitors to pin notes about the creatures they'd seen that week. A shy boy wrote, "Tiny crab under rock," and grinned when Emma thanked him like he had given the museum a treasure. Reporters asked where the rest of the pearls had gone. Thomas gestured to the library shelves, to the touch tank, to the bins of gloves and beach rakes by the door. "Into this," he said simply. "Into teaching people how to keep a promise to the water." On opening day's last tour, dusk pooled in the windows and the tide breathed against the shore. Thomas watched Emma guide a girl through the nacre exhibit, her voice sure and bright. He felt the quiet click of something settling into place, like a bead finding its thread. The shell house was small. It was enough. They started arriving before the doors unlocked, drifting down the boardwalk in pairs and small clusters, like the tide returning after a hard wind. Men who had once snorted into their coffee at the bait shop showed up with work gloves already on. A woman from the diner brought a tray of cinnamon rolls and set it on the counter without charging a dime. A high schooler Thomas recognized as a loud laugher from months back stood in line to sign a volunteer waiver, eyes lowered, pen shaking. No one said the words "I'm sorry" out loud. They didn't have to. They showed it. Emma took charge in the way only a 10-year-old who has learned to be brave can. She taped a handwritten list to the door labeled "Beach Teams" and read out the names like a coach. She pressed buckets and tongs into hands, passed out mesh bags, and explained the rules she had decided on herself. Anything alive goes back. Anything sharp, tell an adult. If you find a shell you love, hold it like you mean it. When she raised her orange flag and pointed downshore, 100 feet moved in the same direction. Martha moved through the museum with a clipboard like a ship's quartermaster, checking salinity in the touch tank, rotating the brass plate so afternoon sun made the engraving glow, guiding retirees toward tasks that matched their knees and backs. She had printed small cards for the exhibits that paired facts with stories, because she believed people remember both or neither. Thomas watched a couple from out of town read about the old co-op, and then quietly donate the price of a night's stay to the jar with Grace Tide etched on its side. In mid-morning, a pickup idled at the edge of the lot. Calvin sat behind the wheel for a long beat, then killed the engine and unloaded 2 brand-new skimmers, a set of heavy rakes, and a portable water tester still in the box. He walked them over to Thomas without meeting his eyes. "I heard you needed these." Thomas nodded, took the handles, and set the equipment by the supply shelves. "Thank you, Calvin." It wasn't absolution. It was a place to start. Calvin nodded back and left before anyone could clap or jeer. Emma watched him go and said nothing, which felt like its own kind of grace. By noon, the cleanup lines looked like a living sketch of the shoreline, bright dots bending and straightening in rhythm with the waves. Kids compared what they'd found at Emma's sorting table: cotton swabs, fishing line, a toy wheel from a long-gone truck, and chose jars labeled microplastics, metal, or mystery. Every so often, Emma held up a whole shell and asked whose day it belonged to. A little girl chose one and pressed it to her ear the way cartoons taught her to, then grinned when the room went quiet for her fake ocean. Thomas spent the afternoon doing whatever was needed most. He tightened a hinge. He read a paragraph to a man whose eyes didn't read anymore. He showed an older couple how nacre stacks patience into radiance, and watched their faces soften as if they'd discovered something secret inside themselves. When the sun tipped west and the volunteers straggled back with tired legs and clean hands, the beach looked lighter, as if it had exhaled. They gathered on the porch steps with paper cups of lemonade. Emma counted the bags by the door and tallied the day on her clipboard. Martha announced next week's exhibit rotation and a lecture on tides. Someone started a slow clap, not for Thomas alone, but for the work that had been done by everyone who had once decided he was a joke. The sound rose, not loud, just sure. Thomas looked out at water that kept its promises in its own time and felt the old ache ease. The return tide had come, and it had brought his town with it. Thomas waited until the volunteers had gone and the sun leaned low enough to gild the water in copper. The beach was clean again, almost new, but quiet in that way it only became when everyone else forgot to listen. He sat on the damp sand with an old notebook, the kind Grace used to fill with pressed flowers and tide sketches, and turned to the last blank page. The first line came slow. "My dearest Grace," he wrote, pausing to let the ink settle before it bled. His hand was older now, but steadier than he expected. "It's been years since I've written anything that wasn't a label or a ledger. I thought I'd run out of words, but tonight, with Emma asleep and the sea whispering your name like it always does, I realize I never stopped talking to you. I just started doing it out loud." He smiled faintly, the kind that cracked the corners of his mouth. "You were right, my love. The sea did keep her promise. I didn't believe it for a long time. I kept thinking you'd left something unfinished, and I was supposed to finish it for you. Turns out, you'd already set it in motion. Every shell, every storm, every small kindness we shared, it led right here. To her." To this, he looked toward the shell house, its soft amber light glowing from the hill. The laughter of children lingered in the walls even after closing time. "Emma talks about you now without crying," he continued. "She tells visitors her mom believed shells carry stories. She says we're still listening. You'd be proud of her, Grace. She's got your eyes, always seeing what can be healed, not just what's broken." A breeze lifted, salt brushing his face like a kiss. He closed his eyes, hearing the waves lap closer, each one a heartbeat from something larger. "The Pearl Farms papers came through," he wrote. "Your name, Grace Smith, is on the deed again. I think that's the sea's way of signing her half of the letter. You'd laugh at the idea of lawyers and ghosts working together, but maybe that's how promises survive." He took a breath, slower now, and added, "Sometimes I still wake up reaching for you, but lately I find my hand resting on the quilt you made instead, and it feels enough like peace to go back to sleep. Maybe that's what love becomes when it's done trying to prove itself. Steady, quiet, true." Thomas folded the page carefully, sealed it in a small glass jar, and carried it to the waterline. The tide was receding, leaving a smooth patch of sand still glistening from its touch. He dug a small hollow with his hands and placed the jar inside. "You were right," he whispered. "The sea kept her promise." He covered the jar, pressed his palm flat over the mound, and waited as the next wave reached up to meet it. When the water withdrew, it took the last of his tears with it. The horizon shone pale gold, and for the first time in years he felt her there, not as memory, but as tide. The shell house shimmered with soft evening light. Rows of chairs faced a small wooden podium, decorated with shells glued in careful spirals. The air carried the salt of the tide and the hum of anticipation. Locals filled the room, people who had once laughed, now sitting upright with folded hands, eyes red-rimmed before the first word was even spoken. Emma stood behind the podium, barely tall enough for the microphone. Thomas adjusted it down for her, his weathered hand steadying the bass, then stepped aside. The chatter stilled. The little girl who had once been teased as the shellman's daughter took a slow breath, clutching her note cards with both hands. "Hi," she began softly. "My name's Emma Smith. My dad built this place, but really, it started with my mom." Her voice trembled, but she didn't stop. "Mom used to say that the sea remembers everything you give it, your laughter, your promises, even your pain. She said one day it would give something back. I didn't believe her at first." A murmur rippled through the audience. Emma continued, her tone finding rhythm. "After she passed away, my dad kept walking the beach. People thought he was just collecting trash, but he wasn't. He was listening. He was waiting for the sea to speak." Thomas looked down, his jaw tight, his eyes shining. Martha stood near the back with a hand pressed over her heart. Emma held up one of her shells from the art project, cracked, glued together with gold dust between the seams. "This is the one that broke," she said. "The day I dropped it, I thought I ruined everything. but when we opened it, there was a pearl inside. Someone sniffled audibly in the second row. Emma smiled faintly. Dad taught me that even broken things wash up beautiful again. That if you wait long enough, the tide brings back what you thought you lost. She glanced at him then, her eyes full of a quiet pride too big for her age. She looked back to the crowd. The shell house isn't about treasure or luck. It's about keeping promises to each other, to the sea, to what we love. My dad always says the ocean has moods, like people do, and maybe forgiveness is just one of them. A small laugh moved through the room. She straightened the papers she no longer needed. So today, I just want to say thank you to everyone who helped, even the ones who changed their minds later. You showed me that people can come back, too. The silence that followed was the kind that only happens when everyone is feeling the same thing. Then came the applause, slow, then rolling, until it filled the rafters. Thomas covered his mouth with one hand, overcome. Martha dabbed her eyes behind her glasses. Even Calvin, standing by the door, clapped with his head bowed. Emma stepped off the podium and ran to her father. He lifted her up, holding her close as the audience kept clapping. Outside, the tide crept higher, brushing against the stilts of the shell house. It sounded like breathing, steady, endless, alive. The morning rose pale and silver, the kind of dawn that seemed to hold its breath before the day began. Mist clung low over the water, curling around driftwood like memory. Thomas walked alone, his boots sinking into cool sand, the ocean whispering the same rhythm it had for all his years here, patient, steady, alive. The town behind him still slept. The shell house, with its curved roof and glass windows that caught the first blush of light, stood quiet against the horizon. It looked like something the sea itself had built, a promise made visible. The last of the volunteer banners fluttered faintly in the breeze, the word Grace painted in Emma's uneven hand, brushing against the railing. He walked slower now, not out of weariness, but because he wanted the walk to last. Every step brought echoes, Grace laughing as she chased foam down the beach, Emma's small hand tucked into his, the sound of shells clinking in a bucket beside them. The tide had pulled most of the footprints away, as it always did, but he could still see faint impressions of the past pressed into the sand. When the first beam of sunlight broke through the clouds, it struck the surface of the sea and scattered into thousands of sparks. Thomas stopped. The water glittered like a field of pearls, tiny reflections of everything he'd lost and somehow regained. He bent down, scanning the tide line. There, half buried in foam, lay a single shell, perfect, whole. Its surface caught the dawn like glass, spiraling inward to a soft pink heart. He picked it up, feeling its weightless smoothness in his palm. For a long while, he didn't move. The sound of the waves and the hush of wind filled the silence between breaths. "You kept your promise," he whispered. His voice barely carried over the water. He crouched and set the shell back where he'd found it, just within reach of the tide. The next wave slid forward, touched it gently, and began to pull it away. The shell rocked once, twice, and then disappeared beneath the foam. Thomas stayed kneeling, watching as the current took it farther, until it was only a shimmer in the distance. The sun rose higher and the mist thinned. Behind him, gulls called over the roofs, their cries sharp and clean, as if the world itself was starting over. He stood and brushed the sand from his hands. Somewhere down the beach he could hear Emma's laughter, a clear, bright sound carried by the wind as she ran toward him. Martha's voice followed, warm and steady, calling them both back for breakfast. Thomas smiled, not turning yet. The sea's rhythm pulsed in his chest, not as sorrow now, but as quiet certainty. He looked once more at the water, at the endless horizon it guarded, and said the only words that felt right. "Thank you." The waves rose, broke, and receded, carrying Faith back to where it began. The sea answered not with words, but with light, glinting across the water, alive and eternal. If this story resonated with you, Please to subscribe to the channel and support us. See you tomorrow for another story.